It could be about that. I mean, for example, one of the things that we did during the recession, the car industry is quite a good example. Everybody remembers in the 1970s, British Leyland and all of that, and that was seen as kind of loss-making firms being propped up. One of the things that the Labour government did during, the last Labour government did during the recession was to, if you like, recognise that the car industry was internationally competitive, but it was really struggling, and viable plants were going to go bust. And we actually tided them over, and now we're seeing that car industry helping to get back on its feet. So it can involve that, but it's not simply about cash.
Let's hear from Bob in Kent. And Charles in Wakefield and Tilly in Devon. I know you all have questions for Ed Miliband, but what are your general issues? What kind of areas do you think Ed Miliband should be concentrating on?
Well, Victoria, I believe in a strong opposition, and I'm afraid we don't seem to have one at the moment. And I think the biggest problem we've got is that Mr. Miliband and his frontbench colleagues keep putting their head in the sand about the amount of debt that the past Labour government accumulated on our behalf. I mean, I personally don't understand why Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling aren't being brought to account over it. I mean, they've gone very quiet, and I'm sure they're enjoying their fat pensions, which, I mean, obviously not unique to a Labour politician.
Brought to account in what way, Bob?
Well, I mean, if you bankrupt a company, if you max out your own credit cards, or if you mismanage almost anything in life, there are consequences. And these guys seem to be able to, run up £1 trillion worth of debt on our behalf, and then just walk off into the sunset with their nice little earning package of, protected pensions and so on and so forth.
But they would say, they don't, as you know, they don't buy the argument that they were responsible for this country's deficit. They say they had to spend money to bail out the banks, and if they hadn't, we'd all be in a right old mess. And there was a global financial crisis.
Yeah, of course there was a global financial crisis, but, government debt isn't new. We always live beyond our means, regardless of who's in power. We never run a balanced book. We never sort of we're not even addressing the capital. We're just paying interest at the moment. It's and then what I'm saying is, if you do that in your own personal life or in your corporate life, then there are consequences. But these guys don't seem to have any consequences.
So what would you want to hear Ed Miliband say that would make you think, yep, they've acknowledged what they're responsible for?
Well, that in itself would be a big move forward. But I would like to hear that they've got some realistic policies and credible ways of getting out of the current situation without adding to the debt mountain.
Okay, Tilly in Devon. Hello.
Hi.
What do you think about Ed Miliband?
I have a good feeling about him.
Right.
He seems like a very nice guy. He seems like he has integrity. I'm a Labour voter. I felt betrayed by Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. But my main concern at the moment is, how can I trust this new kid on the block? When I look at what Nick Clegg did, I feel totally betrayed by his promises regarding tuition fees, for example, and he made that pre-election pledge. And I'm wondering, how can I ever trust a politician again?
Any politician, but yes, you want to hear from Ed Miliband.
I want Ed to convince me that it's worth my while going and ticking his box, and that he's going to keep to his pre-election pledges.
Well, do you know what they were?
I don't know what they are.
Right.
I need him to convince me, A, of what they are, but B, that he's going to keep to them. Because obviously these guys don't follow through.
Mm. Yes, it's a good question for any politician, but absolutely. What about you, Charles, in Wakefield?
Basically, I think he's unelectable. He's like Ian Duncan Smith was. And, people like that. I just think he's got no gravitas. He's got no importance. I think he's too young. He's got no life experience. And I just don't think he's credible. I've voted Labour all my life. I would never vote Conservative. I couldn't do it morally. I just couldn't vote for them. But we need to have a credible opposition. He treats PMQ's Cameron wipes the floor with him every week. He just treats it as if it's like a sixth form common room. He just doesn't seem to be taking things, seriously. I know he'll probably come back on and say, I'm taking it very seriously and all the rest of it.
Well, he's listening to you right now, Charles. Ed Miliband, this is a lifelong Labour voter. He just says you have no gravitas. You're unelectable.
Well, obviously, I don't agree with that. Let me tell you about Prime Minister's questions. I just caught the end of what you were saying. What I try and do at Prime Minister's questions is ask the questions that I think the country wants asked. Now, Prime Minister's questions is always a lot of argy-bargy, but the thing I've been concentrating on in the last few weeks is around the National Health Service. And the reason I've been concentrating on that is because I've got such fears about what the government's plans means. Now, sometimes you win at Prime Minister's questions, sometimes you don't. But I think what's really important is to ask those kind of questions and the questions that matter to people around the country. And I'm going to keep doing that.
I just don't think anybody takes you serious. This isn't a personal attack by any means, but I just don't think people take you seriously. It's just, you just don't seem, to be involved in the process. I mean, I think it's quite clear to everybody, you're not going to be the Prime Minister of this country by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, I would put my life on that. That is not going to happen. And if Labour are going to win an election, it'll be with somebody else, somebody like Peter Hain or somebody like that, who's got a wealth of experience of life. And, who can show that, yes, in this country, I've done this and done that. Like, I gave a speech this morning, and it was just like, British jobs for British people. Who said that? Wasn't it your friend Mr. Brown? What was that all about? It was just became a laughing stock. My local council have got a policy emblazoned on all the wagons and everything. Local people first. I mean, that's obvious. Complete waste of money. Always local people first. I live in West Yorkshire. I don't want to be paying for the sea defences to be fixed in the Outer Hebrides, do I? It's just a complete rubbish statement, and that's all we get from the politicians all the time in the local councils.
Let Mr. Miliband respond, Charles.
Well, I'll definitely pass on your compliments to Peter Hain because I'm sure he'll be pleased. Look, Charles, we'll have to agree to disagree. I'm going to keep doing my job as I see it, which is to talk about the issues that matter. This morning's speech, I think, is about a very important issue, and I think it's really important, actually, to our region, to the region in Yorkshire, where I'm an MP, because I think creating those high-quality jobs for the future in manufacturing and engineering are really important. We had a very exciting project nearby to us when we were in government, which was about carbon capture and storage. Now, we're not going to bring lots of jobs in the coal industry back, but what we can do is create new jobs in clean coal and carbon capture and storage. So I think the speech this morning is about an important issue, which is how we create those real jobs for people in the future.
So as a government, you would create those jobs. How?
Well, it's not about us creating the job, sorry. It's about us saying we can support high-quality British manufacturing. Just to give you one very simple example. I don't know whether I was cut off when I was saying this.
Go on.
In government, we recognised that the car industry, while in the 1970s we supported British Leyland and all that didn't work, in the 2000s, during the recession, the car industry was internationally competitive, but plants were in danger of closing, and we provided some support to the car industry, Nissan, Jaguar Land Rover, other organisations. And actually, you're seeing some of the results of that, including today with the Nissan announcement. But it's not just about cash. It's about saying the money government already spends, hundreds of billions of pounds, how can we find ways, within the rules of international competition, because you've got to be very careful to do that, how can we find ways of making sure that if you can support local jobs, you do. You take that into account when you make your procurement decisions. The Bombardier example, the train manufacturer, is an obvious example where we didn't do that, and that's been a real cost to jobs in Derby.
So you acknowledge that the way you set up the procurement process led to the decision to award Siemens that contract for train rolling stock, and it was your responsibility.
No, I don't acknowledge that, because I think the government could have changed course on this. When we were in government, on another transport issue, we changed course on the procurement contract, and I think the government could have done that. I guess what I am saying, though, is that there are deep lessons.
In terms of that procurement process, you can't change the rules halfway through the contract process, can you?
No, but at preferred, I don't want to get into the details, but at preferred bidder status, which was the status it was at, you can find ways of redrawing the contract. You can find ways of opening it up to other firms, and they could have found ways, in our view, of helping Bombardier. But look, there's a deeper lesson, Victoria, I acknowledge, for both parties, which is that too often, and this was the argument of my speech this morning, too often government thought we don't want to be protectionist, i.e. British Leyland, supporting loss-making companies, all of that. But that meant government thought, well, we just stand aside. There's nothing we can do to support our manufacturers. And actually, that's not what other countries do, as people well know. And that's what I'm arguing for today, is a change in approach.
But you talked about Nissan and the help the last Labour government gave them, and you say we're seeing the benefits now. But you also made some bad choices. You gave 150 million to Rover just before it collapsed, and a year before it was sold to a Chinese company.
Yeah, that may be right. That may be right.
Well, then it shows that governments can't always accurately predict which manufacturing company. So therefore, you end up wasting taxpayers' money.
Well, if what you're saying is the conclusion that we should draw from this is that government should just stand out of the way, that it wasn't right to support the car industry during the recession, I don't agree with that. I'm not saying that you'd always make the right decisions. I also say it's not just about cash. Let me give you one example. Apple and Intel are incredibly successful firms in the United States. Not many people know this, but they came about because of a program called the Small Business Investment Company Program in the United States. That was government-backed guarantees with the judgment made by the private sector to help small firms. Now, we don't have something like that in this country. That's why I've been talking about a British investment bank this morning, which can actually help those small firms to grow, because you know and I know, and you've probably had lots of people on the programme saying this, that there are lots of small businesses in this country who just feel they can't get that loan from the banks, and that hasn't been properly addressed, and this might be one way of doing it.
You are now seen by some, rightly or wrongly, as a party that isn't business friendly, and you probably won't be the next Prime Minister if people have that perception, will you?
Well, I don't agree that we're not business friendly. I think that I've spoken out on the issue of bonuses at the top of some of our banks, and I think I was right to do so. I think that's a pro-business thing to do. Why do I say that? Because part of the problem is that the banks aren't properly supporting our small businesses, and they're paying out lots of money in bonuses while they are not actually providing the proper help to the real economy. And I do think the banking system has to change. It's an important industry in itself, but it's got to serve the rest of the economy. And I'll also add this, Victoria, which is that no part of our society can be immune from the rest of it. In other words, when people are paying themselves bonuses in the banking sector, they do have to take account of what happened during the financial crisis, the fact that lots of people are paying the price of what happened in our banking system. And I don't think that's an anti-business thing to say. I think that is actually about us being one nation, one country together. And I think there are lots of people actually in the banking industry and certainly in business who recognise that.
A lot of people believe your party contributed to the financial crisis, contributed hugely to the deficit this country has, that it's partly the last Labour government's fault. You disagree, I know. You said it on many occasions. But plenty of voters believe that. Do you acknowledge that is a problem for you when it comes to you wanting their vote at the next election?
Well, let me say very clearly on this. I think that the last Labour government, along with governments around the world, didn't do enough to regulate our banks properly. That's what caused the financial crisis. And I acknowledge that. And I think that's a really important thing to say.
But you will not acknowledge spending too much.
Well, I don't think that the crisis at Lehman Brothers happened because we put too much money into schools and hospitals.
No. It's about the deficit, though. I'm talking about the deficit. Of course it wasn't to do with Lehman Brothers. The fact that there is the deficit that we have, some say, is partly because of the amounts of money that the last Labour government spent.
The deficit happened. The deficit went up so much because of the fact that we had a global financial crisis. That's why I mentioned Lehman Brothers. And look, my two kids were born in an NHS hospital. That hospital wouldn't have been there if the Labour government hadn't put the money in. I'm not going to say that was wrong. I'm not going to say that was a mistake. I think that was the right thing to do. And the reason, look, if we could have our time again, I'd say take more action to stop the global financial crisis happening. That's true of our government and governments around the world. That's the price that people are paying at the moment, is for that financial crisis happening around the world. And that's why we've got to learn the lessons. And a really important thing I said in the speech this morning, the lessons are about regulation of the banks, but they're about much deeper things than that. They're about us having not just such reliance on the financial services sector, but building up our manufacturing strength. We have great manufacturers, but there's a lot more we can do to back British firms and have that real strength that we need.
Why do you think, then, that at a time of big spending cuts, very little growth, public sector job losses, unemployment, etc., why aren't you and your party doing better in the polls?
Look, my general view is you leave poll watching to other people. But
you must have conversations about this privately. Why aren't you doing better? What do you think the reasons are?
Let me say why I think. Labour got a very bad result of the 2010 general election. Lots of people left us. I think that's because people felt we weren't sufficiently in touch with their lives, and that they were feeling financially squeezed, and we weren't doing enough to change that.
But we're 2
And,
years
there's a
on
number-
from that now.
number
We're
of
over 2 years on from that
but it
now.
takes time. But it takes time. But it takes time. Look, it takes time for parties to recover. And
Have you got enough time before the next election then?
Yeah, but of course. But look, the thing I say about this is that the thing that you have to do as a politician is not watch the polls. What you've got to do is do the right thing. And that's what I'm doing. I'm doing the right thing